settled, we just have one announcement. As you were walking in, you should have received an evaluation sheet or two. And we really would appreciate it if you will complete the evaluation sheets. They'll be collected tomorrow after the service. There will be people waiting at the doors to collect your evaluation sheets. We really need your feedback. And if we're going to do this again, it's important for us to know what we did really well and where we can improve. So please complete your evaluation sheets. So right now, we're going to begin our third plenary session. And our plenary session is being done by Dr. Kiti Freier Randall. Dr. Kiti is a friend to many of us. Many of you have heard her at other conferences that we've held. And so she's no stranger to many of us. And one thing I will tell you about Kiti, every single time I've heard her, and I've heard her many times now, she's just incredibly dynamic. And the one thing that I love about her is that she is so passionate about what she does. It's often said in vocational counseling that if you really want to find your career, you should think about what you're passionate about and then invest your energies into that. And this is what Dr. Kiti has done. She is a pediatric neurodevelopmental psychologist and a professor. And her specialty is specifically for at-risk children and moving them to resiliency. And how she does this is through providing service and training to enhance the physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual lives of children and their families. And so this first plenary is titled Raising Resilient Children Today, Understanding Risk. And so we present to you Dr. Kiti Freier Randall. We ask you to give her your undivided attention, and we are praying for her as she gives this presentation. She said to me right before she came up that even throughout last night, the Holy Spirit was talking to her, God was talking to her. So I can assure you that whatever she presents to you is going to be something that comes from her theoretical framework, but also from her heart. So I present to you Dr. Kiti Freier Randall.
Good morning, sisters and brothers. Welcome to this morning's session. And it's my privilege to be here with you this morning and to share a passion that I have for children. And as Elaine was saying last night, I was going through, and there's a lot of cognition, there's a lot of things to think about in what I want to share. But I was really struck that it might be the only time that I have to speak to you about really what I see is the issues for children in our world today, and the second part of this morning, and what as a church we can do about that. So I'm going to speak with passion. I don't mean to ever offend any of you. It comes from my heart. So filter it through God's filter in your life as I speak. But I want to speak openly about the things that I've seen in my 30-some career of working with high-risk children and the opportunities I've had to visit almost 40 countries and to talk to people. And I know in my heart the issues I talk about are global issues that our children are facing, because I've heard from many of you what children suffer in your community or what we as adults have suffered as children. So I want to talk to you first about the risk factors. What are some of the predominant risks we see in children, and why are they so risky? So we're going to start off by realizing that children are 25 to 50% of our current population, depending on your country, but globally, they are 100% of our future. And let me take that a step closer. They are 100% of our future church. And so we must look at what they are facing, and become equipped to assist them. You know, my father-in-law, I got married 7 years ago, and my father-in-law was already in his early 90s, and he's a devout Lutheran. And just after we were married at Christmas, my father gave him The Desire of Ages. And he's on probably his 5th or 6th read of The Desire of Ages. And I remember the first time he read it, he came to me and he said, I don't know who this Ellen White is, but boy, is she the best writer I have read. And after his 2nd or 3rd reading, he came to me and he said, I know now why you have a passion to work for children and why you do what you do. And I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, it's right here in one of the quotes from Ellen White. And he gave me this quote out of Desire of Ages. And he said, youth is the sowing time. It determines the character of the harvest for this life and the life to come. We must be aware of the sowing time, and that our young people, if we're going to reach the world, we must reach the young. So one of the highest risk issues that face children today is that of education. I often think about, as adults, we think about what is our occupation. But as young people, their occupation is education, and many of them don't have access to education and or quality education. So one of the big risk factors is that almost 70 million children around the world are not permitted or don't have access to school or education every day. In Northeast Africa and Haiti, they have the lowest rates of education availability for the young. What we know is a lack of education results in less employment. Less employment impacts the infrastructure of a country. It also is a health risk. Areas with poor quality of education, this impacts the workforce. We see in those areas more teen pregnancy, more gang violence, more theft, more drug use. More crimes happen in non-educated communities. One of the other things is many of our children who have disability, who struggle academically, globally, we don't have enough resources to handle the special education needs of children. So one big risk factor is education. And I want to talk about in terms of gender. There is a lack of education globally for girls. Women and girls in the developing world are often denied the opportunity for education. A lack of education limits their prospects. It decreases family income and resultantly reduces health status. A lack of education puts women and girls at the risk of trafficking and exploitation. It limits the economic advance of entire countries when women and females are denied education. Now, when we think about health, one of the biggest global health risk factors there are is that of obesity. Childhood obesity is one of the most serious public health challenges of the 21st century. The prevalence has increased in an alarming rate, and globally in 2015, the number of overweight children under the age of 5 was estimated to be 42 million. Did you hear that? Under the age of 5. Many of the infants I work with are severely obese because of the way that they're fed and nurtured. Over half of the overweight children under 5 live in Asia, and 1/4 live in Africa. 17% of children in the United States are obese. That's not just overweight, that's obese. And in Europe, in the European regions, 1 in 3 11-year-olds are overweight or obese. Obesity has serious, lifelong consequences for our children in terms not only of their physical health, but also of their psychological health. And this is a significant issue for our young people. In terms of health, another huge risk factor, and we heard about it in children's ministries more yesterday, was that of HIV. Currently, HIV affects those in their most productive years. About a third of new infections globally are for young people between the ages of 15 to 24. Women represent half of all adults living with HIV worldwide. So as more women contract the illness, so do more women of childbearing age, which results in more young people, more children who will then be exposed to the virus. So the majority of children who are infected with mother-to-child transmission, either during delivery or breastfeeding. So we know that 1.8 million children worldwide are living with HIV/AIDS. And a very significant factor of them will acquire the disease through breastfeeding or through delivery and birth. Another huge risk factor for health is just the access to food, the ability for young children or for children to have food enough to eat and sustain life. We look at diet itself, what foods are available when food is available, and poor nutrition is rampant in all areas and in all countries. I already spoke to you about how it impacts obesity. But also, much of the food that children eat have what we call empty calories. There's not good life-sustaining nutrients. We are moving away from fresh foods to processed foods. We see more allergies. We see more health consequences as a result of the food we eat. I need to tell you that with the children that I work with, the majority of them, the ones that I see every day, come from drug-endangered environments. It means that their parents use substances. And more than likely, the mother used substances while she was pregnant. And what I see is that about 85% of the children that I work with have asthma or allergies. And what I do know is that the gut, the stomach, is the second brain in our body. And so it tells this brain how you're feeling. So when you have allergies, asthma, these kinds of things, there's a higher rate of irritability. There's more difficulty with attention and focus and learning. And for some children, it actually makes them more aggressive. And so understanding food sensitivity, giving healthy foods does a huge impact in terms of the health and well-being of children. And I spend, even though I'm a psychologist, a good portion of my time trying to identify what are the food-related issues that are impacting the psychological health of the children I work with. And this is a very important and significant issue. The other thing, though, is starvation and malnutrition. In areas of severe poverty, in many areas globally, there is a lack of food, and so children suffer from not having enough nutrition. But I need to tell you that many children, even in regions where there is enough food, are starving. Many of the children I work with are starving. I have foster parents or grandmas or aunties who come in and they'll say, you know, this child is stealing. I'm like, the child is 2. What are you stealing when you're 2 years old? But it is that they are hoarding food. They are hiding it because they're afraid they might not have more food later. And this happens in my community. I know it's happening in your community, that there are children where the family, even though food can be available, because of mental health or addiction risk factors, are not providing food for their children. And so I see basic nutrition as a huge issue in terms of the health and a risk factor for our young children. Of course, one of the main issues of risk, particularly for so many of the young children who live in chaotic homes, homes where substances are a problem, homes where poverty is an issue, there's the issue of safety. Many children suffer from abuse or neglect. With abuse, this is when harm is perpetrated on children. Physical harm, where children are harmed by having been physically harmed by an adult who's entrusted to their care, most often children. Often physical harm happens to the very young child. And it happens with a poor expectation of development. So many times young children are harmed by their parents because they're frustrated with the child and expect the child to do more than the child is developmentally capable of doing. They're upset with them for wetting themselves or for crying or having other needs. Although this doesn't sound well, I need to tell you the honest truth, is that if a baby makes it through birth and they are born healthy into this world and they live, the number one reason that a child will die before they reach their first birthday is because their parent will kill them. That's because we don't understand children and infants. It's because we don't take the time to help parents who are stressed out caring for their child, to help them when they need that help. Let me tell you, if you have parents with young children in our church community, we need to support them. We need to provide them those avenues for help and support. So physical abuse is a very significant concern, particularly for the young. Emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, the abuse that you have, that you feel that you weren't wanted, or that you can never do right, or that you're always criticized. Emotional abuse is rampant in our society and affects many young children. Unfortunately, also, there is the issue of sexual abuse, where children are exposed to acts of sexual activity or pornography, or they themselves are direct objects of abuse. This is a significant issue for many children in many communities. And while all areas of abuse have long-term ramifications, sexual abuse has very significant long-term psychological and physical ramifications. But there's also spiritual abuse. And what I mean by that is, rather than having our spirituality and our sense of our purpose in life being something that's a gift we give to others, instead it's something that we abuse people with and make them feel guilty or harmed by us, by our sense of our own spirituality. Then there's neglect. Neglect is when the actual needs of a child are not met, and there's physical neglect. There's times when physically infants and young children are not provided access to medical care. It might be available, but they're not provided it. That's very neglectful. Or they are not able to go to school, or they're not given the food that might be in their home. There's a lot of different reasons, but neglect is significant. But emotional neglect is devastating to a child. It means that they are ignored. Their needs are ignored. They themselves, emotionally and relationally, are ignored. And I want to show you just a few things in terms of factors related to that. In terms of child abuse, as I mentioned, the youngest children are the most abused. 1 in 3 to 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have been molested by age 18. In some communities, that may be higher. Children who've been abused and neglected are more likely to engage in illegal activity as they grow up and to be arrested as a young person. Child abuse happens in all ethnic groups. Let me just stop there for a moment because I want to talk to you about what I see in the United States and then also globally about child abuse. There may be things that in our own culture that we see as abuse, and there may be things in other cultures that are seen as abuse that are not seen as abuse in our culture. So, one of the things that I hear when I'm working with families where child abuse has happened, particularly physical abuse, and I hear from parents that those are my children, I brought them into the world, so I have the right to treat them as I wish. That's a global issue. That's an issue everywhere that I've ever heard or seen. But really, they are God's children. And we are the vessels that God has allowed to have these children and to respect them and to lead them in His glory. When this is about 10 years ago, I was in the country of Turkey. And I was at the first child abuse conference of that country. But the only reportable abuse at that time was if a child didn't go to school. That was the only reportable abuse. A physician could decide whether or not a physical or sexual harm should be reported, but the only truly reportable abuse was whether or not a child went to school or not. And I know around the world there are different cultural and societal opinions about whether or not we can or should harm children. I look back to the history of how child abuse was identified in the United States of America. A woman, this is over 100 years ago, but a woman in the United States saw a child being kept like an animal under the porch of a house. She couldn't bear seeing that child abused so badly and kept worse than even a pet would ever be kept or an animal would be kept. So she tried to do something about it. But there were no laws that protected children at that time. No laws. There was nowhere to go. And so finally, working with the Society for the Protection for Cruelty to Animals, there were laws that you could not abuse animals. So working with the Society for Protection of Cruelty to Animals, they actually used that society to charge that family with abuse. And that was the beginning of understanding abuse for children in the United States of America. And we still suffer from that not happening. Women are more likely to be held responsible for neglecting their children because women are seen as the primary caregivers of children. More than 8 out of 10 children who are abused by their parent. If one child in the family is being abused, then generally other children in the family are also. And what's important, and we're going to talk more about this, is that not only is this significant to that current child being abused, but the cycle of abuse then continues, where children who are abused grow up themselves either to choose a partner who's abusive or for they themselves to become abusers. And so this is a huge problem that we need to deal with. This is a brain picture of a healthy brain and a brain of a child who was abused. And you can see on the left side, you can see that the healthy brain, right, has more activation. More of the brain is working. More of the brain is alert and engaged in learning. But when we've been abused, we lose a lot of that. So when we talk about this, we are not just talking about physical harm. We are not just talking about emotional harm. We are actually talking about changing the architecture of the brain. And this is a very impactful thing that is a huge risk factor for our children. When we talk about neglect, the lack of engagement, the lack of experience, the lack of relationship, you can see on the left side of the screen, this is a normal 3-year-old's brain. On the right side is the brain of a child who's been severely neglected. And you see the loss of potential that happens in neglect. So once again, we can say, oh, that was only neglect. It's not only neglect. It has very significant ramifications in terms of the long-term outcomes for children. There's other areas of safety, of course, and that is domestic violence. Children who are in homes and families where there is interpersonal violence between the adults in the home, and often the children in those homes are abused as well. Then there's the issue of bullying. One of the main factors that I ever get called to speak at a school about is the fact that children bully each other. But today, in the world of technology, that can be cyberbullying, which has very significant ramifications because it can be spread so far, so quickly, the abuse that we do to one another. In fact, children actually do cyberbullying to their teachers, and I've had teacher friends who've quit their jobs as teachers because of the cyberbullying that occurs. And then I mentioned drug-endangered children. Children who grow up in homes where substances are a problem represent about 85% of all children who will be abused or neglected. When substances become a problem, the risk factors for all areas of risk are significantly increased. And sometimes we think that's just for families out there, but I want to let you know the issue of addiction and substances is a problem in our own church and in our own communities, and we need to be aware and face that. The other thing that that children are facing is child trafficking. Now, sometimes we think about children who are homeless on the streets. Those children are at high risk, but how did they get there? How did they get there, and how did they become so vulnerable to human trafficking? Many of them come from homes of abuse and chaos and substance abuse. And so as a result, human trafficking is a huge issue for our children today. Street children in general. Homeless, run away from home. Children in war zones are at significant high risk as well. And many of you represent communities where there's wars going on. And of course, we all look today at the issue of terrorism. I know about that because, as some of you may know, in San Bernardino, where Loma Linda is, a year and a half ago, we had terrorism in our community, about a quarter mile from my office, where the terrorists came in and shot many of the people who were close to us in our community. And so children now also face how we approach and deal with terrorism. In terms of domestic violence, it is the primary cause of homelessness in women, which then puts more children at risk of being on the street. 60% of homeless children are sexually abused before 18 years of age. If we, in our local church community, see children on the street, families on the street, women on the street, we know that there is something we need to do about it because of this risk. Children who witness domestic violence or interpersonal violence, or even community violence, 40% of them suffer from anxiety, 48% are severely depressed, and 75% of these children over 15 years of age will run away and be on the street. You see, we have a lot of work to do to be there for the children of risk in our community. Then we have the risk of addiction. Now, I am what you call an immigrant to the technology world. I wasn't born into it. In fact, many of us here are immigrants. But our children are natural citizens of the technology world. And obviously, there are really good things about technology, but there are really bad things about technology. It's sort of a rule of life. As good as something can be used for the good, that's the strength it has to be able to be used for the bad. Okay? And we know technology has a lot of good, so we know it can have a lot of bad. It offers to our children a world that they may not otherwise have access to or be aware of. It offers the ability for family connection. I get all of that, but I want to talk to you about when it becomes an addiction. And I want you to know that most of us are on the edge of our own addictions with technology. Many of us are. Some of us, maybe you like me, don't have our phone working here. Our access is a little limited. And so we feel a little bit less secure because we don't have full access to everything in technology that we do at home. So we ourselves are a little impacted by this issue of technology. But post-millennials, the current young children of the world, spend approximately 35 hours per week watching television. This is not in addition to their iPads, iPhones, etc., etc., etc. That's watching television. This is more time than the people in France are legally permitted to work in a week. There's something wrong with this situation. Infants are exposed to technology media in the first few months of life. This looks like torture to me. This is so wrong. When you understand baby development, this makes you sick to see that. And that there's actually manufacturers out there that are producing gadgets for baby strollers and baby seats that will put them in front of technology instead of in front of you and me. I had a 3-year-old. Does everybody know what a zombie is? Sadly, that we know that, right? Sadly, we know these crazy figure. I don't even know how kids are doing it. But in my work, I often have children draw for me a picture of their family engaged in doing something. I've had more than 1 3 or 4-year-olds draw zombies as their family. It's scary that they would identify that as family. I had a little 14-month-old. I gave her a book to try to turn the pages in the book. Her grandparents were raising her because she was drug exposed and her parents were on the street using drugs. And I said, wow, these grandparents, they seem to have some resources, and this child does not even know how to open a book. So I said to them, I said, really, your grandchild, you need to get them a book. They don't even know how to turn the pages. Oh, yes, she does on her iPad. She only knows to turn like this. Let me tell you right now, we don't have time to get into it, but under the age of 2, there should be no technology. It is not right for development. It is not right for all avenues of neurodevelopment and psychosocial development and spirituality. It is not right. But thanks. So too much or misused technology or screen time can negatively impact both the physical health and the mental health of our children today. In terms of physical health, it can result in a sedentary lifestyle, meaning you don't move. You are just in front of a screen. And when that happens, it can result in more issues related to obesity. And remember, I just said obesity is one of our biggest health issues. Let me tell you this. When you're in front, or anybody is in front of a screen, because of how we are created to pay attention to that our brain has to go to seeing what is out there and what is good and safe and what's happening in that world, or just identifying what is, our actual body metabolism goes lower than when we're sleeping. Okay, do you get that? In front of a screen, your metabolism goes lower than when you are sleeping. And what do many people do when they're in front of screens? Eat. So if you're eating and you're in front of a screen, big obesity issue right there, right? So we need to watch that. I talk about it in terms of what I call the new disorder for children, and that is techno-isolationism. Technology, when it becomes isolating, when it takes the place of human relationships, when we have to have it, when we choose technology over relationships with our parents, our siblings, our families, our peers, then we have techno-isolationism. I can't tell you, I'm just starting to learn as an immigrant to that land why it's so important that people like you or like your event, right? Because everybody gets this sense that, hey, I'm liked. I can't tell you how many young people have told me they have 3 or 4 boyfriends. They've never met one of them, right? Let me tell you, this is what we call fake friends. They are not going to be there to help you in the time of need, even though they like you on social media. We call it no-socialism or no-socialism. This is when we do not understand how to socialize in a healthy way. Techno-isolationism also results in sleep disturbances. Do you know that you should not have any screen time or what we call blue light at least 1 to 2 hours before sleeping? And many of the children I work with go to bed with a screen on. Also, violence. Children, even if you protect where they go, children are exposed to a vast number of violent themes, even with casual technology use. And technology is the major venue for violence towards children, for cyberbullying, or for child predators. I teach a course at Loma Linda sometimes that's about trauma in children. And I talk about the issue of child predators, that there are people who watch the internet, who look on the internet to see who's chatting in the social media and where they are to find those children. I work with law enforcement who've had to go find those children, or who fortunately found them just before they were going to be taken by a child predator. And we think oh yeah, that's just out there. That doesn't really exist. Do you know that every day Facebook and other social medias have to remove people who are predating on children? I had 2 male students in my class who said, oh, I don't know, because the theory is that within about 3 to 5 minutes of a child posting on the internet and saying, hey, I'm with my parents and we're in Paris, what's there fun to do here? Within 3 to 5 minutes, they will have propositions of people who will take them around. They act like they're peers, but they're often predators. So the 2 young men in my class said, oh, I don't know what that's about. I don't think so, not in this area. So they went after class, and they got on a chat room for kids, and they started chatting and saying, hey, I'm 16, my parents are here at Loma Linda for a meeting, and what is there to do around here? Not sure if there's anything good to do or fun to do around here. Within 30 seconds, they had 3 propositions. So I did not know about this, or I'd have talked to them, but they actually told them to meet them at Burger King, which is just down the road from their hotel, the hotel that's near Loma Linda. And they went there and they saw that 2 showed up. That was in 30 minutes of posting. 2 predators had shown up to take this 16-year-old girl to show her around. That didn't exist, of course. It's in our communities. Of course, what we see with technology, when we overuse it, when it becomes so significant, we see a higher risk for depression, we see a higher risk for anxiety, and we see a higher risk for social skills deficits. When all of your relationships have been over technology, you do not have the skill sets to interact. There's also a part of your brain, it's the frontal part of your brain, which is for planning, judgment, organizing, and we can see that too much time on technology impacts that part of your brain, and we see it in attention problems with children. We see it with them being impulsive. We see them with poor problem solving. There was a study done that showed just 9 minutes of a fast-paced television cartoon has immediate effects on the 4-year-old brain and executive functioning. 9 minutes. They looked at cartoons that were on television. In 9 minutes, impacted the frontal lobe of the brain. They could not do as well in problem solving and focus and attention. The other thing that we see are problems with sensory, how you take in information. The main problems we see is what we call proprioception. It's just the awareness of your body in space. Where is my body in space? I know my body, so if I touch the table like this, I know the table exists. If I don't have a good awareness of my body, I might touch it like that. That seems more aggressive, and in fact, many children are becoming what we call, they look more aggressive. Children need outdoor activity. They need play where they bump into things and they touch things and they experience their world and they roughhouse play with their father or their siblings and there's interaction. You need that to learn where your body is in space. And we have more and more sensory disorders because of the increase in technology. Children who do not learn through play are more likely to be clumsy, have difficulty paying attention, trouble controlling their emotions, poor problem solving, and demonstrate difficulty with social interactions. So there's 2 occupations of childhood that children need for good mental health and well-being: education and play. And we need to make our environments have that accessible and safe for our children. And as I said, as parents and as adults in the world of these children, we are prone to spending more time than we should in front of the screens and ignoring our children. It is wrong when it is technology who is raising our children. Okay, now we're going to talk about addiction and young people for a minute. As you know, in the United States, Colorado was the first to legalize marijuana, and now many other states have followed suit. And we're seeing more and more issues related to young people and substance abuse as a result. There is no single group more impacted by alcohol and drugs than our young people, either because their parents use and they can be harmed, or because they themselves are at risk of using. The average age to start experimentation with substances is about 13 to 14. However, if you come from a home where substances is our problem, it's about 11 to 12. In Southern California, our average age of onset of substance abuse is 9 years of age. And I know we're not the only community where it's becoming younger and younger. Primary substance of abuse is alcohol. For young people, marijuana dominates the abuse world. With Australia used to have the highest rate of marijuana use in young people. However, with legalization now, the United States and Canada is also climbing in terms of their rates. Stimulants are often a drug of choice, but access is not as high as it used to be. What is now the fastest climbing addiction issue in our young is opiates. Well, in any population, but it's opiates. Heroin and prescription pills. Many kids will get their first exposure to a prescription pill by seeing their physician for a sports or other related injury and then become addicted. And so this is the fastest growing rate of addiction. And so we see parents introducing substances to their children. Often substance abuse is learned in the home. And so we need to be a part of changing that. Another risk is, of course, the home itself, where it lacks basic needs for shelter, safety, and care. We have a large population of homelessness globally. In every single country around the world, there's the issue of homelessness. The poor you will have with you always, and we are on mission to service and minister to the poor. Of course, some of the other major risk factors in homes is the breakdown of communication. On average, parents speak about 11 to 15 minutes directly to their children each week. And those are usually about whether or not they've done their schoolwork or have their schoolwork or whether they've done their chore, whatever it is. But it's not usually a relational context. We also see financial crisis in many communities. In any community, if you see the curve where there is a financial crisis, where finances are going down, in those communities, the opposite curve is child abuse goes up. So whenever you see financial instability, you will have an increase in risk to children. And so we need to be aware of those communities. The biggest crisis, one of the biggest crises I see is the poverty of relationship, of which we will talk more about that. In terms of emotional trauma, depression is one of the most significant mental health issues, particularly for children in the world. The highest youth rates of depression are in the Eastern world. It is the leading cause of disability worldwide, and females are typically more affected than men. Suicide is the second leading cause of death globally for 15 to 29-year-olds. Did you hear that? Suicide is the second leading cause of death. Is this world so hard to live in that we want to take our life? That is a message we have of hope that we need to bring to these children. Anxiety has the highest youth rates in the Western world. So anxiety is significant, and it's most significant in that world. But I see one of the biggest risk factors, and you know, Dr. Barna talked about this yesterday, is that we are losing our worldview of hope, of spirituality, of Christianity. I see with our young people a spiritual crisis, hopelessness, and a loss of meaningfulness. We don't have a sense of purpose anymore. In French, we say the raison d'être. We have no reason to be. And as human beings, we are innately created to have a reason to exist. And it's this crisis that is the huge risk factor for our children across the world. There's a loss of tradition, a loss of spirituality, a loss of religious custom, no sense of purpose, and no sense of contribution or meaningfulness. One of my first jobs when I became a psychologist was to work in a juvenile correctional facility, which is basically a jail for kids. And I had a lot of energy and pretty naive, and I thought, if I could just find out what did these kids want to be when they grew up, I could help them get there. We could find meaningful people in the world who would want to educate these kids. So did they want to be a teacher or a fireman? Whatever it was, I just wanted to know so we could get there. So I took 6 of the kids I was working with, 6 boys, and I sat them there. They're between the ages of 15 and 16. And I said to them, look, I just want to know, what did you want to be when you grew up? And we're going to try to find a way to do that. They looked at me like I was speaking a different language. And then one of them felt sorry for me and raised their hand and said, Dr. Kiti, we wanted to turn 18. Many of our friends didn't make it to 18. I had nowhere to go. They didn't have a sense of purpose to belong in this world. They didn't have meaningfulness. They didn't have a sense of anything. They just wanted to turn 18 because their friends didn't make it to that age. We have a crisis, a spiritual crisis for our young people in this world. So I want to talk to you about a study, because this study is very impactful. It's called the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. It's based on this, that when events happen to us, they leave a record in our brain, right? Things that happen to you, they leave a record in your brain. The brain is altered by those events. It's encoded. And the nature of the alteration depends on the type of event. And we know that adverse childhood experiences can alter development and lead to a lifetime of vulnerability. This is what this study wanted to look at. It was a very large study with 17,000 adults who participated. And they looked at childhood experience and then how that looked in terms of adult health. There were 10 categories. If they happened to you, you got a score of 1. If it didn't happen to you, you got a score of 0. So you have a score of 0 to 10, and I'm going to show you what those are. It didn't matter how many times, just as a child, when you look back, do you think that happened to you? If it's yes, you get a 1. If it's no, you get a 0. So these are the 10 questions. When you were a child, up through age 18, did you ever experience child abuse? So you get 1 point for whether you say yes to psychological, 1 for physical, 1 for sexual. So that could be 0 points or 3 points. Neglect. Were you emotionally neglected or physically neglected? So that's 0 to 2 points there. So you can see abuse and neglect make up 5 points. Then in your household, did anyone have a substance abuse problem? Were your parents separated or divorced, or were you separated from your parents? Was there depression or other mental illness in your home? Was there domestic violence or interpersonal violence in your home, and was a family member ever imprisoned? This is a score of 0 to 10. Whenever I do this talk, people are figuring out their own score. Remember, I'm talking about risk. What I show you next will show you risk, but we also will talk about resiliency. And the fact that you're sitting here means you're resilient, so please don't worry when I show you the results. What you need to worry about is all those children we need to help, okay? So, as your number goes up, if you go from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, as it goes up, you have an increased risk for heart disease, chronic lung disease, liver disease, obesity, and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. Each one goes up in a graded fashion. That means 1 is more than, or 2 is more than 1. That means 3 is more than 2. That means 4 is more than 3. Every single time one more thing happens, you have a higher risk. So here's some of the results. If you have a score of 4 or higher, you have a 460% risk of depression compared to those who do not. 1,220% increased risk for suicide attempts, alcoholism, illicit drug. You can see these are amazingly high statistics. They call it the findings of the century because there are such significant impact that what happens to you as a child affects both your physical and mental health as you grow up. The conclusions of the study indicate that the greater the number of childhood traumatic exposures, the greater the risk of early adult disease and death from any cause. There are many chronic diseases in adulthood that are determined in your childhood, not by disease, but by what happened to you. I do not know anything more that can tell us we need to intervene in the lives of our young children. Let me tell you this, the Center for Disease Control, which is it's a big regulatory office in the United States, said, wow, this is incredible, that what happens to you as a child has this much impact when you grow up. We want to study the elderly. We want to look at those who had a score of 6 or higher, significant risk, and we want to see how they're doing after the age of 65. Do you know they couldn't do the study? Do you know why? Many of them had already died. That we see with a score of 6 or higher, people who experience considerable trauma during their childhood, on average, die 20 years younger. Do we have a mission? Those suffering significant childhood trauma have double the risk of early death. This is the trajectory that we see. You see, it begins with adverse experiences that disrupt our development. Then we have social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. We adopt high-risk behaviors. We have disease, disability, and social problems, and eventually death. I see the mission of each one of us, of each congregation, of our global church, to help people off of this pyramid, because we have a hope that this does not have to be the trajectory of risk in the lives of our children and our families. And we'll talk more about that later. So, with many children or families, we meet them in the now. We need to understand their history, but we need to believe in a future that doesn't have to be that risk, I work often with law enforcement because of working with drug-endangered children. And I heard one law enforcement officer say that they had broken into a home because drugs were a big problem, and there was a 6-month-old baby in that house. And the officer picked him up. They had their own 6-month-old baby at home and looked at him and said, "In 20 years, I will be arresting you." That's a horrible thing to say to a 6-month-old baby. But if we as a community, as a church community, as individuals in our community, do not get involved with high-risk children, that is the trajectory of that child. We cannot be in denial. We cannot be, yesterday the speaker spoke about warfare. We are in spiritual warfare. We have to help those who are at risk. If we're going to raise resilient children, we have to understand their risk and realize that their biological and psychological characteristics interact with the environment. It is the relationship to the environment that predicts their outcome. As I mentioned earlier, though, what happens then is if the environment is abusive, you're more likely then to be abusive. If your environment uses substances, you're more likely to do that. This was a Mexican advertisement, and it shows the cycle of abuse, that you start off young, but you grow up and then become the perpetrator of violence, and we need to intervene, so that's not it. Just before I end, I want to show you a short video clip that is it's a commercial in Australia, and I think it will let you feel this more significantly.
Looks like rain again today. Dark clouds gather and fill the sky. Don't know how to talk to you, just know how to say goodbye.
I don't think so. Did you see it back there? Go back where you came from. I understand. Go back where you came from. What's wrong with you, Harry? Stop crying. Get over here. You know what you think. I've had enough of you. I've had enough of you.
Children see what we do, and children do what we do. So we must make a difference in their lives. You know, I always wondered when I was a child, when it said in the Bible that the sins of the fathers go down unto the 3rd and 4th generation. I was like, why? Why does this happen? Why are we burdened with the sins of our fathers? But more and more I realize that the modeling we have is what we become unless there is intervention. You see, relationships will characterize us from the cradle and the grave. And there is more and more evidence that shows how we're raised when we're young will impact us as we grow up. They talked yesterday between the ages of a few months of age to 13 years of age, that this impacts you, who you will be as an adult. In essence, it suggests that we grow up to be like our parents. Let's be those parents that kids should be. I'm going to talk more in the next talk about how this happens, and I want to emphasize it more then, so I'm going to quit now. But what I want to share with you is that how we label children, how we tell them who they are, that's how they will become. There was an experiment that was done where children were given a mouse, and they were to train this mouse to run a maze. So I'm going to cut the room in half and say, you're in grade 7 over here, and you have to teach the mouse to run a maze to get the cheese. And so over here, you have a mouse that is genetically engineered to be very bright. Over here, you are also in grade 7, and you have this mouse. But you only have regular mouse, no genetic engineering. So over here, you're excited because you have a smart mouse, and you fill out it, you make sure the mouse gets watered, fed, you make sure it learns how to run the maze. Over here, you're disappointed because you just have regular mouse. So nobody gets very excited about helping this mouse and feeding it or taking care of it. At the end of the week, this mouse is ready for Mouse Olympics. Over here, this mouse hasn't even learned what cheese is yet. But do you know there were no differences between those mice in that experiment? The only difference was the label the experimenter put on the mouse and then how the children treated the mouse. What are the labels we're putting on the children, and how are we treating them? You know, we have these things that we do in terms of our memory, our habitual responses, where Paul says, I do not understand my own actions. I do not practice or accomplish what I wish, but I do the very thing I loathe. This is because we have repeated experiences in our brains that dictate how we behave, and we need to find ways to break those patterns. Since the religious and spiritual choices of American teenagers echo with astonishing clarity the religious and spiritual choices of the adults who love them, lackadaisical faith in our young people is not their issue, it is ours. It is our responsibility to do something. Galatians 6 says, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. As a parent, we reap what we sow. As a family, we reap what we sow. As a church, we reap what we sow. And as a world, we will reap what we sow. What is it that we are sowing for our children? Teenagers mirror their parents' religious faith. Young people in our churches are not discipled in the way that leads them to active faith as an adult. It is us who needs to do that. I'm going to do this. We need to understand risk. We need to know that many children have high risk, but they are not doomed. We need to believe in resiliency. We need to believe that things can be different for them. And here's 5 conclusions we'll end on this morning in terms of risk. This was written by a colleague of mine who wrote a book called Our Lost Boys, who was worried that so many boys were imprisoned for life because of serious crime. And why? Why are so many young men being imprisoned for serious crime? And this was his conclusion. Youth risk behavior is everybody's business. We must, every one of us, get involved. Parent education must start prenatally through adolescence. We need to be there to partner with parents. Child abuse prevention is the cornerstone of preventing youth risk behaviors. We must detoxify that social environment. Watch what it is our children see. And a non-punitive, love-oriented religion which institutionalizes spirituality will function as a buffer against social pathology. This was the conclusion of someone who surveyed the children imprisoned for life. We have a mission to do. So resiliency is the capacity to maintain competent functioning in the face of major life stress. This is what we need to have a hope in, and we will talk about after the break. There are many children in the world who are saying, help me, It might look like a pretty picture, but they are saying, help me. And many times it doesn't look like a pretty picture. But we, as a church, have a responsibility to make a difference and to help those children at risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiti. I told you she was dynamic and passionate. So now you feel excited, right? And you're ready to go help. But you can't go yet until she tells you how we can become a village. So please come back. You're going to go to break now. You have until 10:45, but I'd like to suggest, excuse me, that you come back at about 10:40 so that at 10:45 we can start promptly and make sure that we hear everything that Dr. Kiti has to say. Just 2 announcements before you leave. The evaluations are going to be distributed as you're leaving, as you're coming back. So please get your evaluations. We'll be collecting them tomorrow after the service. And we also have bags, conference bags for sale. And they will be available at the bookstore for $5 or 4.60 euros, €4.60. I'm not sure, €4.60. And you can purchase those at the bookstore. So if you're interested in taking back some additional bags, you can get those at the bookstore. Have a great break, and we'll see you back here at 10:40.
I, the Lord of snow and rain, I have borne my people's pain. I have wept for love.